These days, there are a lot of accessories for a Breville espresso machine. Honestly, I'd argue there may be too many accessories for a Breville espresso machine. Some of these are really necessary and can help a lot with your espresso, and others not necessarily so much. I've been testing a lot of combinations of these different accessories that you see on the table, and I'm going to walk through what I think can be really helpful and what is maybe a little superfluous. Okay, now we're going to talk about grading all these accessories, and we're going to use 3 different factors. 1, does it make better espresso? Simple. 2, workflow. Does it make your life easier, or does it just add a lot of extra time? And then 3, cost. Is it reasonable? So let's start out. So the first tool we're going to talk about is the WDT, or as I like to say, the needles. So the idea here is that when you grind your coffee, the grinder creates a lot of clumps. And this is particularly a problem on Breville machines. You'll notice a lot of clumps that come out of the portafilter, and when you tamp those clumps cause channeling. The water likes to just get around the coffee clumps and doesn't evenly soak everything. So you tend to have a lot of bitter coffee around those channels that go around the clumps, and then meanwhile the coffee clumps don't really get extracted, and so you have a shot that's very sharp, sour, and bitter, and just not particularly good. And my feedback to Breville has always been I'd love to see them have a slightly upgraded grinder or even a declumper, but for the rest of us, I recommend using these needles. The idea here is it was invented by somebody called John Weiss, that's why it's called the Weiss distribution technique, and you can break up the clumps with some small acupuncture needles. It'll make a big difference, and I found this helps a lot. Now, this tool I have is a pretty simple one that you can find on Amazon. Now, I'll also show you can make your own WDT at home. And this is one that I've made with just acupuncture needles and a wine cork. And frankly, this is really simple. You can actually just take a paper clip, bend it, poke some holes in your cork, and then put acupuncture needles right in. The only thing you really need to look at is make sure that you have needles that are 0.4 millimeter diameter or less. That helps a lot more. Don't use a toothpick. That's not going to work. But I would recommend just making one of these at home. It's very inexpensive. You just buy some acupuncture needles. It'll make your coffee taste a lot better. The next thing we're going to talk about is a scale. So a scale doesn't directly make your espresso better, but I think it's actually very important. Why? Because it just makes your espresso a lot more precise and a lot more consistent. You'll hear me or others talk about the right ratio of coffee to water, and usually it's always that 1-to-2 ratio. But if you think about it, a 1-to-2 versus a 1-to-2.5 ratio is actually a big difference in taste. If you think about dosing, let's say 16 grams into your portafilter, 8 grams is, that half ratio. And if your flow rate's 2 or 3 seconds, you're talking about 3 or 4 seconds difference between a nicely extracted shot and potentially a bitter shot, or vice versa. And so just having a scale where you can know exactly how much coffee you're dosing in and exactly how much espresso you're getting out is a lot more helpful. And while Brevilles have a really nice volumetric control, and they also have a time-based dosing for grinding, they're not perfect, especially the time-based grinding. If you grind finer, it's going to take longer to get the same dose. If you grind coarser, it's going to dose a lot more coffee faster. So you want a scale where you can measure by weight. Now, there are a lot of scales out there. I have 3 on the table right now. And in fact, I've tested more than 3. And I can tell you, as long as you have a scale, it's going to be better. There are nicer scales and there are worse scales, but even this $20 Apex Stone scale is going to make a world of difference. You're just going to find that you're repeating the same recipe more often, that you're getting a lot more consistent. It'll help you learn, am I doing too short of a shot or am I doing too long of a shot? So it's a simple tool that's not expensive to get started and will help you make better coffee over time. The next tool we're going to talk about is the Bottomless Portafilter. So the Brevilles come with this spouted portafilter, but a lot of people like having the bottomless portafilter. And the argument for your espresso is that when you can actually see the espresso coming out of the bottom, you can better diagnose channeling. If it's not coming out nice and evenly and you can see pockets in there, then that kind of tells you that actually you have some channeling. Now for me, that's actually not why I like the bottomless portafilter. I think in terms of controlling your espresso quality and channeling, it's really hard to just stare underneath your portafilter and know exactly where the channeling is coming from, especially on a Breville, which tends to have pretty high pressure. But what I like about the bottomless portafilter is the cleanliness. If you notice when you look inside of a spouted portafilter, you'll see that the coffee and water tends to build up right inside, and the Brevilles actually tend to have plastic. Unless you have the dual boiler with the 58 millimeter, all the 54 millimeters have some plastic inside. And so that tends to collect water and some of your old coffee from your last shot. So a bottomless portafilter, in the meanwhile, it's very easy to just rinse under a sink or even just run a blank shot and rinse some water through this. And that's what I like. Also, you get a little bit more cup clearance when you have a bottomless portafilter. You don't have these spouts taking up an inch of space. And so you can put a larger mug underneath, and especially me, when I recommend getting a scale, you put the scale and you can put a mug and you can still fit underneath the bottomless portafilter. They're a little more expensive though. This is probably the cheapest quality one I could find. Again, it'll be linked in the description below. Okay, next, let's talk about the tampers. So this is the tamper that you get with your Breville machine. Like I said at the intro, this will work. You can make good espresso with this if you know how to tamp properly. Now, the key with tamping, it's not about how much force you put on it. Honestly, if you're putting pressure and you feel it stop, that's enough. But the harder part is getting a nice level tamp. If you have an unlevel tamp, that's immediately going to cause channeling, which, as we discussed, is a whole problem with the poor extraction and getting sour and a bitter espresso. So you want something that's level that also fits your portafilter perfectly. So one upgrade that I've liked is this Lux House tamper. This just has a little more heft. The top is rounded, so it's a little more ergonomic. I find it a little easier to tamp flatter, and it tends to go closer to the edges of the portafilter. But over time, I've actually upgraded one step further. I've gotten a self-leveling tamper, which is a really nice addition. And what happens, you see there's this outer ring here that sticks to the edge of your portafilter. And so that way, it's always level. And when you press down, there's also a spring, so you can feel it when it gets to the bottom of your puck. This is a really nice addition. And not only do you just have a certain level puck every time, but it's easier. This is a little more expensive though, so I consider this a little more of a workflow addition than an absolute necessity. Okay, since we're on the subject of tampers, why don't we talk about the distributor too? Should you have a distributor? The idea here is when you dose your grounds outside of your grinder into your portafilter, you do your WDT, you're going to have still a sort of wavy, uneven mess in the basket. And this distributor, you can lay it right flat on top of your portafilter and spin it a few times, and it'll distribute the grounds, hence the name distributor. Now, is it necessary? I don't know. This is where I sort of diverge from other opinions, and I think you need to make your own choice based on what's good for you, espresso, workflow, and cost-wise. And I also found just using a WDT, a decent side tamp of the portafilter, and then a self-leveling tamper was more than enough. Frankly, just a good WDT and good hand distribution with a tamp on the Breville portafilter can work too. Adding the distributor just was an extra step for me, and these are what I would kind of call medium costs. They're not trivial. So I don't use this, but a lot of people love it, and a lot of people swear by it, so something that you might want to consider. Okay, next let's talk about the dosing funnel. The idea here is that you're dosing straight into your portafilter, but the grounds tend to clump up and create a nice mound, or may I say, a not so nice mound, because it creates a mess when you usually pull it out and you try and distribute it with your palms or with a WDT. And so by adding this dosing funnel right on top, it just creates an extra layer, and there's just a lot less mess, and just makes your workflow a lot easier. Now, let me say a couple things here. One, I actually don't use it. Why? Because I have another hack, and it's kind of a simple hack that I learned because I just didn't want to get a dosing funnel. So when you put in your portafilter and you press it in, just kind of shake the portafilter, and as it's dosing, it'll actually level out the grounds quite a bit. Frankly, doing that has been a big help for me. And I don't use a dosing funnel because I just find it one more extra step. There's also dosing cups. This fits really nicely into your Breville cradle. It'll dose right in here, and then you can actually just transfer it right into your portafilter as such. I'm not as big of a fan of these. Why? It's an extra step. Two, half the time when I dose into the portafilter, there's still a mound of coffee in there. It still makes a mess. So I tend to like these dosing funnels better. Also, the nice thing about a dosing funnel is when you have it on and then you WDT, you can be pretty darn vigorous on it and really go to town with your needles. Okay, so as we move down the list of accessories, we're going to go into one area that I'm going to call a bonus item, a bit of a mystery item, and that is the puck screen. The idea here is this is a metal mesh screen that goes on top of your puck before you put it into the group head. The mesh should distribute the water more evenly across the top of your coffee, thereby aiding into a more even extraction, avoiding channeling, and getting a nice, more balanced flavor profile. I've used this on and off, and I am a little torn. Now, some backstory here. One day I went to the Counterculture Training Center here in Chicago, And we actually tested a puck screen on a very nice La Marzocco machine, and we found that it actually did increase TDS and extraction and create a more balanced flavor profile. It was a pretty direct increase from going to no puck screen to a thin puck screen to a slightly thicker puck screen. So on one hand, it seemed to work very clearly. Now on the other hand, I never replicated those results on a Breville. Maybe we were just working on a nice machine. Maybe it was a controlled setting. Maybe we only did 6 shots, so it wasn't enough of a sample size. But it never really seemed to add value to me when I was working at home. I've actually asked a group of home espresso aficionados, a Facebook group, which, yes, I know, but they're actually pretty in the weeds here. And I asked them to use a puck screen. And we got like a total 50-50 split, yes and no, with different opinions of both sides. People who are on the yes said it did help their extraction. It did help create a better balanced flavor profile. They also said it keeps the group head cleaner, which is nice because if you think about it, this is just a layer between your coffee and then your shower screen. And so you don't have to clean the machine as often. You don't have to backflush as often. But then you'd hear opposite comments saying, yeah, it's cleaner in the group head, but you still have to clean this puck screen. And this is actually a little bit harder to clean because you need to get in the mesh. And so you usually need the descaling solution or another cleaning powder and make sure this is in there for an hour or so to totally clean out all the gunk and oils that collect in the puck screen. So that's why I say I'm torn. Some people really like it. Some people don't. And I think it's up to you to use. The cost is actually pretty modest. So it's easy to get started and try it out and see if it helps you. Okay, we're going to talk about one more item here, somewhat of a mystery item, but this I think has a little bit more effect. And that is a paper filter for your espresso portafilter. The idea here, unlike the puck screen, the paper filter, you'll actually put it on the bottom of your portafilter and then dose your coffee inside. And the paper filter serves a couple purposes. One, as it's on the bottom, it actually strains out some of the lipids and the heavier compounds. And what I found by doing so is it tends to create a bit of a sweeter shot. Maybe I should say more of a perceived sweeter shot because it just removes some of the body and probably some of the heavier compounds or the fines that create bitterness. So it does seem to change the flavor profile a little bit. 2, it actually makes for a cleaner shot. And I mean, literally cleaner, there's less spraying, which is actually quite an issue on the Breville machine, especially if you want to use a bottomless portafilter. Like I said, it's hard to diagnose the shot, but the Brevilles tend to be set to above 9 bars of pressure. And so if you're using a bottomless, it's almost always going to spray a little bit. Actually, almost all machines will spray a little bit. So if you use a paper filter on the bottom, it definitely reduces spraying. And the third thing that's interesting about the paper filter is it tends to increase the flow rate. I found when I don't use a paper filter, I might get 1.5 to 2.5 grams per second coming out of my espresso machine. And then if I just only add the paper filter, that can step up to actually 3 grams or higher than 3 grams a second of flow. That's actually quite a bit. And I don't quite understand it, to be clear. Maybe it's just that the paper just more evenly pushes the water across, which I guess should be the same as the puck screen, but maybe because it's on the bottom, it just helps distribute it and increases the flow rate. But the point of the flow rate is that you can grind a little bit finer. And grinding finer will definitely increase your TDS and your extraction yield and theoretically, hopefully, your flavor profile. Now, this I find helps a little bit more than the puck screens. And I actually got these papers from Good Brothers. They actually have multiple different sizes, whether you have a 54 millimeter or 58 millimeter portafilter basket. They've got everything covered. I've also seen other people just use a hole punch, and they make these out of number 2 filters. So this is a lot easier to use. You don't have to clean it. You can actually just dump your puck out right away, and the paper filter goes with that. So I find it a little bit more helpful for espresso and quite easy on workflow. I actually debated making a whole video on the puck screens and the paper filters, but there's another good one out there by Lifestyle Lab. I'll link to in the description below, and you can see what he said. He's covered this in more detail than I have. Okay, so we just talked about a lot of different items here. And it gets back to the question of what exactly do you need? Well, first off, I'm going to repeat, if you just got your machine, you don't need anything. Everything's in the box, and you can get by with that. But personally, I find just the WDT and the scale to be really helpful. You can get simple $20 scale and a homemade WDT for $10 or $15. And right there, these two will help you make better espresso. You can go a little further and get a self-leveling tamper. This will help too, but it's not always necessary. Now, on top of that, you got your bottomless portafilter, which this can also help with cleanliness, but again, not always necessary. I think if you just get these two, the WDT and the scale, you'll be good. And then if you add a self-leveling tamper and a bottomless portafilter, I think that'll also upgrade your workflow. But it's really up to you to decide what works best for you, your espresso, your workflow, and your budget. I would actually love to hear what you use to make espresso, what you thought was most interesting of this video, maybe what was even the least interesting of the video. And if you enjoyed this video, hit like and feel free to subscribe to see future videos as it really supports our channel.